Hey, what's going on there, guys? I'm back here today with another deck tech for you. Today we're going to be taking a look at a standard deck, and it's Dega Midrange. So this is a red, white, and black colored deck that combines the use of effective creatures, both big and small, along with removal and answers for the things that our opponent's trying to do. And pretty much we're going to make it so that our opponent is going to have to deal with the threats that we put on the board, but at the same time, while they're trying to deal with those threats, we're getting our opponent off track and we're dealing with the things that they're trying to play, whether they're creatures or other things, and we're just going to get them completely off track, and we're just going to win the game by not letting them do what they want to do with their deck. So, before we get started, if you guys have any suggestions for decks that you would like to see, please leave them down in the comments below. I'll take them into consideration for future deck techs. And be sure to check out the playlist in the description below, where I have all the previous decks that I've covered on the channel, including modern decks, budget decks, and I also have a playlist to gameplay for some of the decks that I've made. So, with this deck, this was actually something that I shared on Twitter, and this was something that I was working on, and I was playing it here and there, but after M14 came out and we got Doomblade, I was just kind of a little bit more pushed into playing it. I really like it for the colors that we have and all the different things that we can play, all the while Innistrad block is still around up until Theros comes out. But the cards that we do have are really efficient. So the first one, in terms of creatures, is Boros Reckoner. So he's a 3/3 for a triple Boros hybrid, and whenever he's dealt damage, he deals that much damage to target creature or player. And for 1 red or white, he gains first strike until the end of the turn. So Boros Reckoner is one of those easy ways to just kind of stall out any really aggressive decks, where if they have anything smaller or anything the size of Boros Reckoner, 3 toughness or less, we can keep mana open, have Boros Reckoner have first strike, and we can just kind of keep our opponent from trying to swing in and deal any damage to us. Likewise, if our opponent even has something a little bit bigger, they're going to be a little bit more weary of actually swinging in, because their creature can deal damage to Boros Reckoner, and we can just redirect that damage back to that creature after Boros Reckoner is dealt damage. So ultimately, Boros Reckoner is like one of those easy ways to just put pressure on the board and not allow cheap swings to get through, at least not as often. I have a playset of Vampire Nighthawk, so 2/3 for 3, flying Death Touch and Lifelink. One of my favorite cards that came out in M13 and was reprinted. So with Vampire Nighthawk, he provides to be a pretty easy blocker for pretty much anything. He can be a good blocker for even ground enemies or anything that's flying and has evasion. We can easily block it. And the nicest part about him is that he also has lifelink, so if we already have our opponent's creatures under control, we can just start swinging in with Vampire Nighthawk, and each time we swing in, we can gain back 2 life, which isn't bad at all. I have 2 Olivia Voldaren, so 3/3 for 4 flying, and 2 abilities. The first one is 2 mana, and she pings another creature, and that creature becomes a vampire in addition to its other types, and we put a +1/+1 on Olivia. So with every ping that we can successfully do, she gets a little bit bigger. And for 5 mana, we can gain control of target vampire for as long as we control Olivia Voldaren. So this is pretty nice up against any decks that are playing like really big creatures. If we're playing up against like something like Junk Reanimator or anything like that, where they're playing things like Thragtusk, we can go and ping during 1 turn, or even later game we can do it all in 1 turn, but we can ping and then following turn take one of our opponent's creatures and maintain control of it as long as we have Olivia out on the battlefield. So it's really nice for that. If we are in the really late game where we have like 7 mana open, then we can just go and ping in the same turn and take the creature in the same turn, which is not bad at all. But ultimately, Olivia is one of those really awesome mid-range creatures that can just really turn a game based on how much mana we have open and what we choose to keep open to be able to deal with our opponent's things. I have 2 Obzedat, Ghost Council, so 5/5 for 5. Whenever it enters the battlefield, target opponent loses 2 life and we gain 2 life. And at the beginning of our end step, we can exile him from the game, and at the beginning of our next upkeep, he comes back and has haste. So Obzedat is an easy way to drain our opponent when we're in that like stasis of our opponent has creatures, we have creatures, but nobody's swinging in because they don't want to trade creatures and it would just kind of be foolish. So in situations like that where we're kind of locked out of doing anything, Obzedat can just go and exile himself, bring himself back in, and we're making a pretty nice and significant change in the life totals. He's another easy way to gain back life, so if we're playing up against anything that's aggressive and is trying to get us down in our life total, Obzedat can come in and can help us out there. Also, the haste ends up being really nice because we can swing in with a 5/5 creature and then we can just exile him at the end of the turn, and he comes back at the beginning of our upkeep, which is not bad at all. Another one of my favorite creatures in this deck is Blood Baron of Vizkopa. So he's a 4/4 for 5 with lifelink, protection from white and black. And as long as we have 30 or more life and opponent has 10 or less life, he gets +6/+6 and has flying. So he just ends up being a huge bomb whenever we're at that point where we have that much life and our opponent is at 10 or less. And at that point, he's kind of like a win more creature that our opponent needs to get rid of, or we just kind of win with him pretty easily. But the protection from white and black is pretty relevant up against like a lot of different matchups. He can't be blocked by things like a Restoration Angel, Angel of Serenity. He can't be targeted by it either. He can't be targeted by any type of removal like Dreadbore, or if our opponent wants to use like a Azorius Charm on him. He just has like a lot of different variable good sides to him where cards can't really target him, which is pretty nice for us. So he ends up being a really easy way to stick something on the board that's hard to deal with. He's a good blocker for anything white or black, and he ultimately is just going to threaten the board pretty nicely because he's a 4/4 with lifelink for us. So again, another way to gain back life and just keep a 4/4 out there that can either swing in or just be a blocker. Then we have our last creature here, which is Thundermaw Hellkite. So Thundermaw is a 5/5 for 5. He has flying, haste, and whenever he enters the battlefield, he deals 1 damage to each creature with flying that our opponent controls, and we get to tap those creatures. So if they have like Lingering Soul tokens or any other flying creatures, Thundermaw just taps down all of them, then we can swing in. Sure, your opponent can still get around things like a Restoration Angel Flash, but still, Thundermaw is just a huge threat that is going to just swing in every turn for 5, and our opponent has to find a way to get rid of him, whether it's like Doomblade or any other type of removal or Azorius charming him. He's just really nice because of that haste, just to swing in with that evasion. Then for our Planeswalkers, we have 2 Liliana of the Veil, so 3 cost, 3 loyalty, 3 cost, 3 loyalty, +1 is going to force each player to discard a card, which isn't too bad for us. We end up like discarding lands most of the time. -2 is going to force target player to sack a creature, which is good up against like the Bant Hexproof matchups and any of the creature matchups where we can just start making our opponents sack things, especially if we've already found ways to remove their other smaller creatures with stuff like Pillar of Flame, Dreadbore, anything like that. So Liliana ends up forcing them to sack, and then the -6 is pretty awesome when we can hit it, being able to separate our opponent's permanents into 2 piles, and they get to keep one, the other one they have to sack. Then we have Sorin, Lord of Innistrad, as a 3 of here. So 3 loyalty, 4 cost, +1 makes 1/1 vampires with lifelink. -2 gives us an emblem where creatures we control get +1/+0 permanently. Emblem can't be removed and the emblems can stack. And then his -6 is that we get to blow up to 3 target creatures or planeswalkers, and then they come back under our control on the battlefield, which is amazing. So if we can hit that ultimate, it's another great way to get back things like if we want to take our opponents like Restoration Angels, Thragtusks, anything like that. So it ends up being just really awesome. I have 3 Pillar of Flame for like Voice of Resurgence and any of those decks that are just trying to be really aggressive in the early on. Mainly Pillar of Flame is going to be really awesome up against Voice of Resurgence just because it exiles it. But up against like anything with 2 toughness that we want to exile, it's nice for that as well. So 1 red deals 2 damage to target creature or player, and if a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. We have 2 Doomblades, so destroy target non-black creature for 2 mana. There are a decent bit of things that it doesn't hit, but there are also a lot of things that it does hit, so that's what makes it good about Doomblade. If we're in a matchup where the cards that we're playing up against, we can't hit them with Doomblade, then we can just side out Doomblade and put in something more appropriate out of the sideboard. I have 3 Dreadbores, so this one's non-biased, so destroy target creature or Planeswalker. And destroying Planeswalkers is definitely still relevant, getting rid of Garrix and other Lilianas and anything else that our opponent may have. But also being able to destroy creatures that it doesn't have a drawback or bias to is really nice for us as well. I have 1 Mizzium Mortars, so deal 4 damage to target creature we don't control for 2 mana, and Overload for 6, so it can be a board wipe for us if we get to that 6 mana point. And then we have 2 Assemble the Legion, so 5 cost enchantment. At the beginning of our upkeep, we put a muster counter on it, and then put a 1/1 red and white soldier token with haste onto the battlefield for each muster counter on Assemble the Legion. So each turn, Assemble the Legion gets bigger, and it makes more tokens for us, which is awesome because we can flood the board with 1/1s that can either swing in or they can just be really easy blockers for anything that our opponent's trying to do. So the Assemble the Legion is a pretty nice win condition for us if our opponent doesn't have a means of being able to get rid of it. We can just start flooding the board, and we can just manipulate the tokens in the way that we want. I also have a 2-of for Blasphemous Act as our last spell here. So Blasphemous Act works really well with Boros Reckoner because it deals 13 damage to each creature, and then we can redirect that damage to like our opponent. Especially if we have 2 Boros Reckoners out there, that could definitely mean game over for our opponent. But it's 9 mana, 8 generic, and 1 red. And it costs 1 generic mana less for each creature on the battlefield. So if our opponent's playing like really creature heavy, then it works towards our advantage where we can just get rid of everything easily. And then for our mana base, we have a playset of each of the shocks. So a playset of Blood Crypt, playset of Godless Shrine, and a playset of Sacred Foundry. For our other dual lands, we have a playset of Isolated Chapel, playset of Clifftop Retreat, and 3 Dragonskull Summit. And then for our last 2 lands in the deck, we have Cavern of Souls. So our Cavern of Souls is mainly going to be going for Vampire, for Spirit, or for Dragon. So if we name Vampire, we can go and we can provide mana for things like Vampire Nighthawk, Olivia Voldaren, and Blood Baron of Vizkopa, because they're all vampires. For Spirit, that's going to be the Obzedat, and it's going to be uncounterable. And for Dragon, that's, of course, Thundermaw Hellkite. So those are mainly the 3 things that we're going to name. I don't find myself naming, like, Minotaur or Wizard for Boros Reckoner, but if need be, that can be done. But Vampire, Spirit, and Dragon are probably the main things that you're going to be going for with Cavern. So that's the main board. Now let's go over and take a look at what we have in the sideboard. So for our sideboard here, the first card that we have is Slaughter Games, which is pretty standard for any red-green base deck that we have for the sideboard. So it can't be countered, and we name a non-land card, and we're going to be able to search our opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for all copies of that card, and we exile them. So up against like Control, Reanimator, and like mid-range style decks, Slaughter Games ends up being awesome because we can pick and choose the things that our opponents have in their deck that we know are going to be troublesome, and we can just get rid of them just straight out from there. So up against like mid-range, we can get rid of things like Thragtusk if that's going to be a nuisance. In Reanimator, we can get rid of Angel of Serenity and Unburial Rites. And then up against Control, we can either go for their bombs or we can go for Sphinx's Revelation so that they don't get card advantage off of it. But having it as a 3-of in the sideboard is nice because even once we use one of them, we still have 2 more in our deck that we can get into, and we can use it on something else that our opponent may have that will keep us from winning. I have 2 Rolling Temblor for any really hyper-aggressive decks, so things like Mono Red, Red Green, Blitz. Rolling Temblor is going to be able to hit a decent amount of things. It's not going to be able to hit every single creature that our opponent has, but it's going to be able to hit a decent amount of them. So for 3 mana, it deals 2 damage to each creature without flying. So it's probably the closest thing that we can get to Pyroclasm without it being Pyroclasm. Pyroclasm is, of course, a lot better, but Rolling Temblor is just what we have to use and deal with in our sideboard to have for all the X2 creatures or less to be able to get rid of them just on the spot on turn 3. Then I have 2 Paraselene, so this is up against the Ban Hexproof matchup, where they have all their enchantments that are trying to buff up small creatures with Hexproof and just swing in and deal like an enormous amount of damage to us. So Paraselene destroys all enchantments for 3 mana, and we gain 1 life for each enchantment destroyed this way. The life gain isn't as important. That's not what drew me into actually playing the card. It's the fact of just destroying everything. So it destroys all Unflinching Courage, Spectral Flights, anything else that our opponent may have. Of course, Rancor is going to go into our opponent's grave, and then it's going to be bounced back to their hand, but even still, Paraselene just gets rid of all of it, so it's not bad. Even if they get Rancor back into their hand, it's no big deal. Their creatures are much more manageable at that point than what they were before with, like, Unflinching Courage and Spectral Flight attached to them. Then I have 1 Ratchet Bomb, so this is for hyper-aggressive decks with like a lot of 1 and 2 drops or 2 and 3 drops, where we can get rid of all their 2 drops or 3 drops, depending on how many counters we put on Ratchet Bomb. We can also effectively play it up against Ban Hexproof, get rid of their enchantments, get rid of their creatures, especially things like Invisible Stalker, so it's pretty easy for that. I have 1 Pithing Needle for any utility lands, planeswalkers, and also Aetherling. Aetherling is a nuisance because it can just bounce itself away whenever we try to use removal on it. So Pithing Needle is an easy way to keep it from being able to use any of its abilities. But likewise, for any utility lands that our opponents may have, like Nephalia Drownyard or anything like that, up against like Control, we can use it against Jace and not let Jace be able to mill us out. But the Pithing Needle is kind of versatile in terms of what we can use it against. We just have to know what we need to use it for, and then we can side it in. I have 1 more Liliana of the Veil, so 2 in the main board, 1 in the sideboard, up against Midrange and Control, and also Reanimator as well. We can put some pressure on them, especially if we play it really early on. We can start making them discard, and if they don't have anything in their hand at all, they're going to be forced to play off their graveyard, and if they don't have Unburial Rites, then, well, they're pretty much screwed because they're out of luck. So Liliana of the Veil puts pressure on mid-range and control-based decks, and it's also good up against Ban Hexproof because it forces them to sack creatures that we can't necessarily get rid of with traditional removal. I have 1 Unburial Rites, so this is up against like mid-range and control as well, because generally in Game 2, they're not going to be setting in Graveyard Hate against us. There's really no point for it. So we can set into 1 Unburial Rites, and up against like mid-range, because they have the removal to deal with our stuff, we can just get back big creatures like Thundermaw Hellkite and anything like that with the Unburial Rites. Up against Control, even if they use like Supreme Verdict or something like that, again, we use Unburial Rites to get back a creature that we need, and then it also has the flashback. And the best thing about Unburial Rites is, because we're only running a 1-of, even though our opponent doesn't know the amount of Unburial Rites that we're using, it's still not going to be enough for them to side in Graveyard Hate. It would be pretty foolish for them to do that, and if they do, it's kind of like a wrong move. It's wasted spaces in their deck against us in their main board, but ultimately just having it as a 1-of is nice to just be able to recur any creatures that we need if they've been removed. I have 1 Mindsparker, so this is up against the white and blue control-based decks. So it's a 3-2 for 3 with First Strike, which isn't as relevant as its second set of abilities, where it's whenever an opponent casts a white or blue instant or sorcery spell, Mindsparker is going to deal 2 damage to that player. So if our opponent's going to try and use counter spells on our creatures, or if they're going to try and use like Azorius Charms or anything like that, Mindsparker is just going to deal damage to them, and it's going to burn them out pretty quick. So Mindsparker just as a 1-of is nice to have if we can draw into it up against like the control-based decks, and we just deal easy damage to them. And then the last card that we have is Rest in Peace as a 3-of, so enchantment for 2, and whenever it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all graveyards. If a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, it's exiled instead. Easy up against the Reanimator style decks and anything that has a influence on its graveyard. Any graveyard-based strategies, we can just easily thwart their plans. So that's the main board and sideboard that I have for Dega Midrange. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the deck. If you did, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Magic the Gathering videos and deck techs. The entire deck list is down below where you guys can check it out and use it as a reference. And be sure to check out the playlist in the description where I have all the previous decks that I've covered on the channel, including gameplay videos of some of the decks that I've made. So until next time, guys, have yourselves a wonderful, fun-filled Magic the Gathering day.